Say welcome officially. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Dr. Roger Martinez for joining us today. We have so appreciated his previous sessions, and I'm excited to hear this one as well. A few little things I want to catch up. Today we are hosted, as always, by the Certificate of Sephardic Ancestry, Jeannie Milgram, and Ray Connectar, and of course, my own Jewish Unity Through Diversity, and we're very excited to have this. I do want to make note in your follow-up email, you will be seeing that we are starting a raffle, and Susanna just mentioned that it's Tu B'Shvat, and we thought from Tu B'Shvat to Purim would be a fun way to have a little raffle. You buy your tickets online. There is an Oded Halachmi, who is an internationally known artist with works in the Guggenheim and the Louvre and a few other places around the world. He has given us a Chanukiah or a menorah, and that's our big auction item. And then there are some jewelry and some books and some other things. So I do encourage you to follow through. And as always, thank you for those of you who are joining us today who help support our programming so we can continue to offer it for free. We really feel that it's important to have this conversation out there and have this material out there. So thank you for all of your support. And one more little plug, if I don't start a cough attack. Next week, we will be continuing the series with Dr. Roger Martinez, who will be having a Q&A. Sorry. Please do send in your questions, and I will say the rest of it after.
Thank you so much for the that invitation and welcome. I mean, as we all know, like it's that time of the year. If you're in the Northern Hemisphere, we're all kind of really getting hammered by bad weather and and some troublesome health. So let's wish everyone a well day. I'm going to go ahead and start my presentation, and here we go. So I'll be in this little circle for most of the day as we're visiting. And then if there are questions, feel free to throw those in the chat. I'll answer those questions afterwards. I think it's always a great idea to kind of, as you're moving through a text or a lecture, to kind of jot those notes in the chat, because then sometimes it's hard to remember where we are and what you were thinking about. So again, I'm Dr. Roger Martinez-Dávila. I'm a professor of history at the University of Colorado. My degrees are from Berkeley and the University of Texas. I've been a professor for now about, I guess about 18 years, and I'm a Sephardic Jewish and Conversos specialist, primarily in archives and libraries, looking at the original documents to really kind of understand this history that we all share and we all love. And that's everywhere from the Vatican secret archives in Italy to Spain and Portugal, the United States, Mexico, and South America. Because I think what we really appreciate, and this is really what this conversation is about today after this talk, is really we appreciate this diasporic nature of Sephardic Jews in this larger community, this awareness that always the tribe is on the move as necessary to survive and hopefully to be successful, to thrive in the world. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball today, but I think this is really, really important from the perspective of understanding how does Jewish history really fit into the larger perspectives of like European history, Mediterranean history, and really our global world today. Because a lot of times I think that is kind of one of the issues that we really struggle with, which is, well, why does this matter? Why should someone who is not Jewish or ever had any connection to Jewish history care or really have some kind of affinity for this? And that's what this lecture is today about. And it's about Renaissance, remaking of the world as a Sephardic people. Ultimately, we're going to spend a lot of time today talking about some different theories and perspectives about what it meant to be a Renaissance person. And I'll contextualize this about where and when that is. We're going to look at a couple different scholars, and what you're going to see is something really, really quite unusual. How special a period of the late 1300s and early 1400s was, but also how Sephardic Jews and Conversos really were a manifestation of like the most kind of remarkable elements of this. Now, when I say remarkable, it's going to be in some ways you're going to feel like, well, maybe that's not so remarkable, but it is because what is happening, what is so unusual is like, yes, there are discoveries by Da Vinci, Michelangelo, there's new political theories that are disturbing like Machiavelli, but also what's really, really happening, which is the true miracle, is what's happening on the inside of people, that they're changing, they're transforming, they're becoming something new. And in this respect, Sephardic Jews and Conversos were at that kind of internal frontier of like finding new ways of living and thriving and sometimes making their way. So as we remember, we're talking about, mostly you're going to send this around Iberia and Spain. And this is just a quick little reminder map of where we are. In the 1300s and 1400s, as the Renaissance is beginning to kick off, we still have a very independent kingdom of Portugal. The kingdom of Aragon is separated from the kingdom of Castile and Leon. And there's still a Nasrid Islamic kingdom in Granada. So this is important because what we see is this old order of, basically very separate kind of kingdoms in terms of religious identities, legal traditions, language, and everything. We're well before the nation state that won't rarely arrive until the 1700s. So that's a little bit of the context. As we think about it too, we're also coming out of this period in the 1300s, moving into the 1400s, of this period of convivencia or coexistence. And this was this idea of a productive, but at times tense and dangerous coexistence between Jews, Christians, and Muslims in Islamic Al-Andalus, as well as Christian España. And so this is just a depiction from one of the Islamic manuscripts showing like the origins of chess and how the game is played in chess. And I think it's a really wonderful metaphor for really understanding coexistence because a lot of times we think of coexistence as this happy-go-lucky, kumbaya, everybody is really getting along moment in history. And that generally isn't true, right? We know that the world is very gray in the sense of lots of different permutations. So sometimes we just kind of we tolerate the neighbor next door because they're our neighbor and it's not going to change, right? That's a type of coexistence because you're occupying the same space, even though we might not see eye to eye. But it also could be coexistence. It can be intermarriage. It can be friendships and things like that. So this is kind of a baseline that we're coming out of the Iberian Middle Ages of this kind of we're used to difference, but difference is really distinct, right? We keep people in their own respective corners, their respective classifications. And that's going to be a big, big issue and a big problem as the Renaissance arrives. Also, we can appreciate kind of almost as like a harbinger of what the Renaissance may feel like, as we can even think about the Sephardic Golden Age in Iberia and someone like Moses Maimonides, this philosopher, leader, and physician, and the author of the Guide for the Perplexed. And this is one of the manuscripts of the Guide for Perplexed presented there. The reason why I always like to go to Maimonides is because he was so modern in so many ways for a time period that we would see as, ages ago, 800 years ago. And if we remember about Maimonides, that he lived in Cordova, grew up in Cordova. If you visit there today, you can still see the synagogue that he was at. And we realize he lived during this increasing period of Islamic kind of intolerance of other religious groups, Christians in particular, Jews as well. And this was kind of this intense religious period for Christians as well. The Spanish Reconquista, the reconquering of Iberia from Islam. And that kind of tension, that type of world really signaled like, how does one make their way in the world when there's that type of tension? And Maimonides, as we remember, instructed us that it's important to survive no matter what. To at times maybe we might need to hide who we are, and find security in a new place so that we can be the people that we should be, whether that is to live righteously as Jews, to return to original faiths, but to be true to ourselves. And that's really is a very, very early concept in this world of the Middle Ages. The idea that you could be simultaneously, I'm Jewish, right? But also to be able to say, well, I can be more respectful of other religious traditions, maybe even practice some of those because it's necessary that so that my family survive. But eventually I will get back to where I need to be. And that was the case with Maimonides when he moved from Islamic Spain to Islamic Egypt and found more comfort and an ability to live there. So now we're going to step into the Renaissance and Renaissance changes. I'm going to spend a little bit of this time today after I go through some lecture material about what it meant to be in the Renaissance and identity. And I'm going to also then at the end kind of really just focus in on one very specific case study, which is about the Carvajal-Santa María families out of Plasencia, Spain. This is a 1500s manuscript. It is an etching of what the city looked like right in 1500. And so it kind of, I think in this way, kind of symbolizes a transition between the old and the new, somewhere in between. So there are still Jewish elements in the city, but also as we move into the 1500s, we know Jews have been expelled. That if you're in Spain, you must be a Christian or practicing Christian or have taken taken that identity up. So the big change with the Renaissance was in terms of identity, there was a growing consensus now amongst historians that social and personal identities profoundly shifted. In short, there was like these social transformations because they shattered like traditional religious identities that, Jewish versus Christian. And now there was this multi-layered stuff, overlapping categories. And that's where the Conversos become very interesting because they're simultaneously in between kind of different kind of stations, social stations, religious stations. And what we see at this time when we talk about identity is that there are group identities, right? And they're starting to be broken down and fractured into individual identities. So this is what's really just shocking about the 1300s was the old adage that we always use in medieval studies to say, and you've heard this before, if your father was a cobbler, you were a cobbler. And this was generally the truth up until the 1300s was um, communities were kind of really stuck in who they were, that there wasn't really this kind of social experimentation. So that if your family had been a family of knights, if your family had been clergy, if your family had been, prosperous traders, and the Mediterranean. All those components would have been very consistent from generation for generation for hundreds of years. And I think that's pretty amazing because, um, especially from like a modern global perspective, we have this idea that people can become more than something, right? We might start as, like I start first as a Mexican American kid from San Antonio, Texas. But then, and my family was my father was a civilian employee at the Department of Defense. My mother was a teacher, a middle school and high school teacher, and there were no academics in my family at all. So for me to become an academic and to transform and to also to recover Jewish history for my family and myself and this identity, that is an act of the Renaissance. It did not exist before the 1300s. And so in this respect, in some ways, we share more in common today in the 21st century with people from the 1400s than people from the 1300s before shared with that next century, which is really remarkable. We tend to think of history as these kind of blocks of time and they're disconnected from each other. But really in very odd ways, we are not much different from the 1400s. We're the same kind of people but maybe with a technological kind of change, with a global movement change. So I hope it kind of maybe starts to expand your perspective of what it means to be an individual today, because you might recognize yourself in the 1400s as like, oh, that's where I was. Those are the same communities. So I want to spend a little time first talking about changes to identity. And this is where the broader perspective of history kind of really comes in. So one of the really critical authors and thinkers of the Renaissance was Jacob Burckhardt, who wrote The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And this was written in the 1860s, and it's really primarily about the Italian Renaissance. And we tend to think of the Renaissance as a movement of towards a movement towards advancement just in Italy, but it was much more than that. And the Renaissance is this pivotal moment in the emergence of the modern individual, the person, and also a secular society. So really starting to move away from some religious traditions. And he argues that unlike the medieval period, where my personal identity, who I was shaped by collective institutions like the church or the synagogue, or even like an idea like feudalism, that you would have, lords that were beholden to other people. The Renaissance witnessed this kind of rise of a self-aware individual who actively, and think about this, they actively created and crafted their own identities. It's very, very similar today when we talk about the digital world and about how we craft digital identities when we're on Facebook or on LinkedIn or on a personal web page, that those are very, very specific views of ourselves that we have shaped to show the world. So this period really started in the late 1300s and early 1400s. Now, just to kind of remind you, what is this text talking about, why it's important? Well, Burckhardt highlights how humanism, which was this notion that humans were responsible for their own development and growth, as opposed to the church or God, but really that humans could be guiding their pathway, was the key component at the time period. And it was a classical revival of cultural, intellectual, and artistic expression. So this means, returning to the ancient period, thinking about how did the Greeks and Romans, how did they conceptualize the world? How did they develop sciences? So that's where we find people like Leonardo da Vinci and Machiavelli trying to break free from these medieval constraints. They're trying to say there's better ways of doing things. There's a different way of doing things. And obviously, this weakening of religious authority also starts to bring out these rise of independent city states, which is really interesting because now cities are becoming self-governing. We have personal ambition that can exceed maybe nobility in some ways. People are really starting to self-define themselves differently from the past. So, what was interesting about this is that these transformations also extended into social structures, and the aristocracy and wealthy merchants, such as the Medici, who we've heard of, redefined power through economic success rather than hereditary privilege. So, this is about social mobility. Additionally, there was this new concept of a Renaissance man had emerged. The idea of an individual skilled in multiple disciplines, and that's that notion of the Renaissance man, the Renaissance person. And so Burckhardt, what he's doing is he's really revolutionizing this idea that there's a shift towards self-perception, a shift towards personal identity, a shift away from group identities, but to individualism. And that's a unique component of what comes later on. So, what was interesting about Burckhardt also was he discusses, these ideas of identity, and he basically argues that these early modern persons perceive themselves, unlike their medieval counterparts, as spiritual individuals. So these are distinctly separate from social groups. So spiritual, not in the sense of religious, but spiritual, like there is an animating force inside of them. And he makes this point, when he writes, in the Middle Ages, both sides of human consciousness, that which was turned within as with which was turned without, lay dreaming or half awake beneath a common veil. The veil was woven of faith, illusion, and child prepossessions, through which the world and history were seen clad in strange hues. Man was only conscious of himself as a member of a race, a people, a party, a family, or a corporation, only through some general category. In Italy, this veil first melted into air. An objective treatment and consideration of the state and all the things of this world became possible. The subjective side, at the same time, asserted itself with corresponding in emphasis. Man became a spiritual individual, recognizing himself as such. So, and Burkhardt is obviously writing from a time period of the mid 19th century where he's speaking about men, but this was also the case for women as well. In many respects, women were guiding their own way. So you could think of Catherine Medici, or you can even think of Donna Gracia, who moved Sephardic Jews and Conversos to the Ottoman Empire during the diaspora period. So this is about this emergence of new types of people. And that's where we really can start to see what is interesting about Jews and conversos is that they were a mix of Jewish and Christian lineages and beliefs, but they also started to have new perceptions of themselves. They're in this really uncomfortable period of who they are. Another scholar we can think about is a scholar who's known as Stephen Greenblatt. And he talks about this idea of Renaissance self-fashioning. So there's a very kind of think about fashioning as clothing, right? Well, in that respect, he felt and believed that during as we're moving to the 1500s, that basically first that there were selves, there were individuals. This is a big deal because in the medieval period, there wasn't necessarily a perspective of you as an individual, but you only saw yourself through your family or through your religion. There wasn't a you in many ways. And this is a really eerie thought because today in this global world, we think about very much so that like, I'm Stephen, I'm Jessica, I'm whoever, and that's me, right? There weren't so much of a sense of me in the past. It was more of like, I'm a Carvajal, I am a Levy, and that was your identity. So he's saying that you could actually become a self and that could be fashioned. And so literally you could think of like there's monotony at the medieval group identities of Jewish or Christian or Muslim. But he said like, no, 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 no. It's much more interesting that something else is happening that put simply and individuality created opportunities for greater variability that you could become more than what you were. So Castilians in Spain, there were conversos, they could become individuals. They could be just as much individuals as we are today. And that also he would indicate that these persons were new individuals that were expressive. They were expressive in all the ideas of that time period. And in this respect, which is really kind of a strange idea, he calls them cultural artifacts. A cultural artifact is that if you think about it, if we're living in a lot broader community, and there are different types of people, we all start to become representative samples of things. They're now, which is really different again, they're the old classifications of nobles and commoners, of religious affiliations, of professions. But now there are these new things that are being birthed out that no one really recognizes at all. And this is in the context then of like, if you think about the Spanish movement towards anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the 1300s, where, they started to impose new laws banning Jews from mixing with Christians. We obviously see forced conversions of individuals and families. And so this is kind of like this type of paranoia, this type of like, people know something's going on in society and they're very uncomfortable with the change. And so they start to actually try to break things up. They're like, we have to have categories. A last person I kind of really want to talk about, and I'm going to skip over the next one because of timing, was a scholar by the name of John Jeffries Martin, who talks about myths of Renaissance individualism. So you can see there's kind of a debate here, right? Because it's like the classic issue idea of like there are two people in the room and there are three opinions, right? So here, John Jeffrey Martin, who I'm a big fan of too, he says, oh, the Renaissance self was not a thing, right? It's not something that is you, but this is so eerie. It's a collection of relations between the eternal and external experiences of the individual. So let's just take a little moment with that. He's really talking about what he calls permutations, that your person really is this kind of weird, flexible intermediary between you on the inside, whatever that you is on the inside, and the outside world, the other community around you. So this is where I think we recognize this in our own lives, where we might be a member, let's say, of a book club, or we might be a part of a sporting club, but then also we have a family life. And then your family life, your relationship with your children, your grandkids, your spouse is very different. But then you also might have another affinity group, like a group of friends that bonds around, I don't know, whatever that might be. It could be model trains or it could be crocheting. But that is the idea there, which is we really are, there's something inside of us that we can't fully see, and we're always kind of shaping it. And it's only through that interaction between back and forth between the exterior world and our internal selves that we kind of manifest an identity. And so this is what's so interesting is we think about now then about Jews and conversos in this time period, the 1400s, as things are changing. Well, now we see individuals that are moving from, they may have been a Jewish noble, but then now they're a Christian noble. So they're somewhere in between two places. Or they may have been, in the past, a group of knights that are Christians, but then by hanging out with new groups of affinity groups like rabbis, and this is what happens with the Carvajals and Santa Marias, they decide to become churchmen. They decide to become religious people. That's just bizarre and weird and it shouldn't happen. And you start to think about it, which is, well, wait a second. Christians who are now mixing with Jews and even intermarrying, they're learning to become better Christians and better practitioners of a religion by following and emulating Jews. So this is why this period is just utterly bonkers. And I use that word really loosely because it's upside down. Everything is changing so fast. It might not be technological change in the way we experience it today, but the world is kind of unraveling for these communities. And I'll skip over Ruggiero for now, and I'll just move along. So what about Jews and those who converted? So I always go back to my great friend and just an incredible scholar, Dr. Jane Gerber from the City University of New York at the Graduate Center, and her book, the seminal work, The Jews of Spain. It remains probably the most important text for understanding the longue durée, the long history of Spanish Jewish experience. I always recommend it. But what does she say about Jews and those who have converted from Judaism into Christianity? And she says, just reminding us, eventually, and it became clear that the converso issue in Spain transcended lines of class, ideology, and religious faith. Even by the middle of the 15th century, there simply was no easy answer to the question of who was a Jew or who was a Christian. And this is where there's a tension that you're going to see here. So we really people can't like label anymore. And that bothers them because they don't know how they fit in relationship to each other. Am I better than them? Are they below me? Or can I interact with them? Are they a part of my group? Creates a type of societal tension and uncomfortableness. But then Jane continues on by saying, but for most of the population in Iberia, the conviction began to spread that Jewish ancestry or race, not a professed religious belief, defined what a Jew was. So this is really a strange thing that's happening now because I've just told you two entirely different stories, which should not make any sense at all. on the one hand, I'm telling you, the Renaissance is a period of new people becoming new things and like exploring new avenues. But I'm also going very retrograde and say, no, 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 no. Because it's so fragmented, we're trying to create labels. The external world, Christians were trying to say, we got to figure this out. And they decide, okay, if you're Jewish, that's a race. If in the same way that we would say today in this modern world about different racial groups from different parts of the world. So there's a kind of irreconcilable tension that exists there, which is um, you can change, but then other people don't want you to change. And that tension creates this very, very tumultuous period in Spanish history. So I would say it was a complete mess, right? But a highly creative period. In the end, what we had was a complete breakdown of the old order of identities, structured religious ones, structured occupational ones, structured social ones that shattered into completely unknowable and experimental ones. It's just really just a kind of a mind blower because um, it's almost like you're starting from scratch. And that's really, I think, the point of creativity. And what became so special, I think, about the Conversos and Jews as well, is that they're in this experimental stage. They're the ones that are most vulnerable, most likely to have to make changes versus other people that have, they've always been Christian and they don't have to make these choices. They're not, in some ways, afforded that, in a strange way, afforded the opportunity to become something that is entirely novel and creative. Now, what we can think about though, which is really another hard part of the story, is like, well, in some ways, this seems like it's a great period, right? That it's a wonderful period for Sephardic Jews. And I'm trying to change the narrative here, you see. This is not a history of Jews that is articulating the loss of the Sephardic people, the loss of Sephardic tradition and religion. It's actually of saying, no, 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 we're not victims. We're actually going to go further. We're going to go plus ultra. We're going to go beyond. We're going to go further into the world and do new things. But that tension, though, was also, though, Spain is moving towards integration. And what does integration look like in Spain? And that creates this kind of human identity that kind of just slides into kind of like broken fragments. So we know in the 1390s, even as just as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, they're doing these incredible works. The anti-Jewish programs where, hundreds of thousands of Jews' lives are transformed or lost. We have these blood purity laws that basically say, we really don't want Jewish converts to Christianity holding public or church offices because we want to enforce some kind of distinction. And obviously, then it really becomes really institutionalized in 1478 when the Spanish Inquisition is created basically to say, everybody get in their box. Everybody get in the box, which is if you have to be a Catholic if you're here by 1492 in Spain. And if you're not a good Catholic and doing it right, whether you're Jewish or Muslim heritage, we're going to correct you. And that could be through reconciliation to the church or death. So this is where I would just dive in this last component of this lecture for the last 10 minutes is just kind of talking, and I really wanted to structure it around the other because I think those are the big ideas and you can carry those with you in your life. And then you can think about, okay, how does it apply to my own life and to the things I'm studying? So it always begins, identity begins with a question, conversos, ideal Catholics or secret Jews. So you can see here in this image, on the far left in the lower corner, you'll see Bernardino Lopez de Carvajal, a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church in the late 1400s, early 1500s, who almost became the Pope twice during this time period. The last time he patted his friend on the back during a conclave and made him the Pope, but he was of Jewish origins, and according to the period time blood purity, he would have been considered Jewish. Next to you see looks like something wood. It's a wood pew in a church, and below it is a Carvajal seal. That's a gravestone. So then maybe they're good Catholics. But then above we see, this book by Martin Cohen talking about the Carvajales that are executed as secret Jews in Mexico City, and there's Mariana de Carvajal right above me. So it's like, what are these folks? What are they? And this is where it kind of centers back into this, let's dive in. We look at a city like Plasencia, close to the border with Portugal in the 1500s. We can start to think about what is its environment, how has it changed? And so here we could see, this is a modern picture from the 2000s where there's a new cathedral, an old cathedral, but then also you can even see the location of the former synagogue, that the city is starting to transform. And then here's the old cathedral. I always like to show these images because this cathedral is a kind of a Roman-esque style. You can see there's not a lot of windows. It's very heavy enclosed. And a lot of this type of architecture actually was used actually for synagogues of the time period, very low slung. So it's no surprise to me in some ways that you'd find Jewish converts to Christianity comfortable in a building in a structure like this because it was a very typical setting. So what I always try to do is try to understand, well, during the Renaissance and these selves, how do you start to evaluate like what's getting unified and what's coming apart? What's creating new? So you have families like, and we look at really at blood because I'm following like a Spanish tradition here, the Jewish Alevi family who became the Santa Marias and the clan of Burgos, and they were rabbinic leaders that became Catholic bishops in the 1390s. But also, because I know it's a broader audience, I would say, we have the Gutierrez de Calleja family, the Fernandez, the Cabreros, the Malduenda, Burgos, and Cartagena families. These are all kind of components of this Levy family that kind of blossom into Spain in the 1400s and become prolific in many ways. And on the other side, we had these Carvajals. And since I can say this, I feel because it's part of my family, they're a bunch of meatheads. And I joke in that way because they were knights that were stuck from the 11th century all the way to the 1400s as a kind of a lower class knight. They were nobles, but they didn't have a lot of wealth. They didn't have a lot of privilege, and there was no social mobility for them. They were stuck in the old medieval way, and they were related to all these other families like Gonzalez, Rodriguez, Trejo, Toledo. Um, so this other side of blood. And really, this is how the Renaissance takes place, which is it's through in some ways it's through ideas, right? It's through ideas and new ways of doing things, but it's also about mixing of peoples, a very, very, very dangerous thing, right? That we see evidence of intermarriage, and this is just tracking, just so you can see by looking at different late medieval last wills and testaments and donations of lands, we can start to understand the relationships between an old world. So in the old world on the right-hand side, which is a knightly family, and on the left-hand side is really part of a merchant and a Jewish family coming together. And how does this kind of play out then? So then we're talking about active roles, performative roles during the Renaissance period. Well, now we start to see like a partnership evolving inside the cathedral in Spain and what is happening with actually these conversos that are, were levies, are now Santa Marias, and then now mixed in with Carvajals who are old Christian. And what you see on here on this particular slide is different categories of offices inside the church. So everything from the bishop on the far right to an archdeacon. Why does this matter? Well, if you look at the green blocks, and then there's some like kind of yellow brown blocks, there are two different families kind of mixing. At first, the Santa Marias are there, the levies. They're the leaders of a new type of Jewish Christian Catholicism. And over time, as pressure begins to become more intense on those well-known conversos, the Carvajals pick up those pieces and they start to fill in the roles. This is actually a type of blood laundering that is happening. And It's because these two families decided we can be something different. We're not Jewish, we're not Catholic, we're no longer knights entirely, we're not rabbis. We're something in between now. And that can create a type of more of a whole. And the way that this manifested itself then was then in the 15th century, Conversos then really start to kind of enforce, at least certain converso families, start to enforce a type of hybridity even in the population themselves. So this is just a little corner of the city of Plasencia. You're looking at a map grid, and you see this Calle de Rua de Zapateria, so this shoemaker street that goes straight through the traditional Jewish quarter or the Jewish Alhama of Plasencia. And you see this large block that's pink La Mota and the synagogue there. So this, in this sense, was the old way of living for sort of that, there were more of barrios, of neighborhoods specifically for different communities, religious communities. But here, everywhere you see a block that has two tones, like blue and white, or red and white, or green and red, these were families that were starting to be mixed heritage. Either it was a family that might have been Christian, but then leasing property to a Jewish family. It might have been a family that was Jewish and Christian and intermixed. So now this dangerous experimentation that the Catholic Church did not want. But these are Catholic leaders. They're running the cathedral, and yet they're trying to promote this new kind of Renaissance identity, which is, in fact, we're something in between, and we're okay with that. And even so, then they even manipulate documents of this time period to the point of we have like the cathedral in Plasencia, they have legal statutes that govern them. So this one is a statute for sobre limpieza de sangre, cleanliness of blood. And here in this one, as they're passing like new reforms for the time period of the Catholic Reformation after the Protestant Reformation, they're passing laws for the church to say no one here in the church can have mixed blood. But everybody who signed off on this document below, to about two-thirds of them, were conversos themselves. So somehow or another, they had made some kind of either pact with themselves or their identities to understand this. And I see you, Gerard. I'm going to wrap up with this last one, which was just this new intertwined practice, which is basically what did they do with this new Renaissance identity, which is the intertwined religion and practice. So the first thing they did in this way is they enacted secrecy statutes, and they collectively agreed that not all members of the chapter needed to be included on matters. And they swore with their right hands raised a pledge. They swore never to reveal their secret discussions to any person. So this is how they start to they know there's only some safe places to work. Or they start to create Friday cathedral meetings. So all the members who were a member of that cathedral that were in these secret meetings were invited for Friday night to conduct church business and to assist in other matters, and to describe the meetings as necessary, and no one could be excused. So again, we see this mixed families really saying, well, Friday's going to be a very special day for us, but we're going to do it in the cathedral. And no one else needs to know about it. So we're kind of having it both ways in between. And I think the most interesting thing for the Conversos was, and Jews, is that they had these new dedications to not Christ, but to the Virgin Mary. And these were first started by the rabbinic side of the family who had become Catholics. And they said, the Virgin Mary, Miriam is important to us. And the Catholics that had mixed with with Jews decided if we want to be the best type of Catholic, we're going to emulate the Jewish side of the family, and we're going to worship Mary, not Christ. So this is this really weird kind of thing in the end, which is, are they Renaissance Jews or are they conversos? In the end, what we see is a total breakdown of the old order of identities, structured religions, occupations, and social ones. It's now completely unknowable. It's experimental. And that is what's so special about our heritage is They created the world we live in today, where you and I can choose to be different people than we started as. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for introducing yourself. I apologize. I've been taking cough drops, so hopefully we can get through this. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you do keep some more questions, send them in so that we have them for the future. But I wanted to point out something you mentioned that I thought was an interesting concept. We talk about purity of blood, and you said blood laundering. I thought
Yeah.
that's such an interesting way of seeing it. I
Yeah, and I appreciate the question, which is because this is the really remarkable thing about Spain and Portugal is that there are very, very well-known Jewish families that had converted to Christianity. And because they were so well known, they're really publicly targeted by the common people. And so what you would often do, and this is really a real benefit of like the Castilian, the Spanish perspective and naming conventions for surnames, is often you're carrying your mother's surname as well as your father's surname, not just your father's surname. And so you could, over time, as you intermarry, you start selecting surnames that are not even related to that are unknown as tainted blood lineages. And in this case, because the Carvajals had done such a great job of really protecting that surname and like really bolstering it, so they do all these kinds of special things in the cathedral to say we're super Catholics, then you can hide behind the name so no one knows except for your internal family knows.
Yeah, and you just said also about the mother's surnames. We had been finding that in the certificates as well as that's how you can trace back easier today. Just an interesting point for those who are looking. So Suzanne had a question. What was the cause that sparked this change in the Renaissance?
Excellent question. I'm glad you're interested in the Renaissance. I'm fascinated by the Renaissance, as you can see. So, the Renaissance is a weird thing. This is why I think it's very similar to our time period. So, in the mid 1300s is when the Black Death, the plague, comes in through the Black Sea, and it is moving down with the Italian merchants who bring it into Italy. Why is this important? Well, what is the real fundamental problem is this type of disease devastates between 30 and 60% of the population in Europe. So depending where you were, if you're in a more urban area, the death rate was closer to 60%. More rural areas, 30%. Curiously enough, actually, Islamic cities in the Mediterranean had the most sophisticated response to the plague. They did not know that it was caused by a flea that was carrying this bacterium, but they knew there was something to do with like urbanization. And so they rapidly started de-urbanizing cities so that they can control the spread of plague. Now, in Europe, this was not as well understood, and this is why you have places like Genoa, Rome, and places like that that are decimated by the population. This crash in population, as you can imagine, and we have this experience very immediately, people start to doubt everything about their lives. They begin to doubt, what has my religion taught me? They begin to doubt, where am I going to get food? They begin to doubt, who really is my friend? Who's going to really help me out in a really difficult situation? And because of the population has shrunk so much, there now is actually humans are actually a priority for the first time in a long time. There's not enough labor to go around. And so there actually is a decision that is actually made was, how do we actually move from maybe actually we only have so many humans to plow a field. We have to be better at plowing fields with fewer humans. We need better technology. Or also, no one's going to be willing to buy, like a very, plain kind of like spoon or a bowl. What they want is something that is a nicer form, that is a more beautiful, that is more creative. And so that requires more specialization of personalities and people. So in some ways, the scarcity of labor actually facilitates people like you and me having more choices because everybody's competing for labor. And so merchant families, lords, and things like that. So this as part of the piece is a labor shortage. The other piece that's really important is this complete breakdown in belief systems, which is God didn't save me. Whoever your God was did not save me. And so I have to do more myself. I have to have more faith in myself as a human. And this is the growth of humanism and the recovery of ancient knowledge. They're rediscovering ancient manuscripts and they're seeing those Greeks who were like who were complete pagans, they were right. Humans can lead their way without religion. So that was part of this cause of the Renaissance too, was deciding we're going to go ahead and experiment. We don't care what the church says. So that's another element of it. There are lots of different components, but I think the labor piece and the collapse of religious beliefs really played the biggest parts.
Thank you. And then continuing in a little bit of a different vein, Renaissance church music contains settings of the Song of Songs as odes to the Blessed Virgin. I'm assuming that you know this. I don't know this. Is this something that is native to the Catholic theology, or is it the influence of the Conversos?
So this is kind of like it's a great, great question, Susanna. And it's kind of this chicken and egg issue, which is who started it,
Mhm.
right? So there's always been a practice of Marianism in the Catholic Church, of like, which is, really promoting Mary as this model woman ideal. Never mind that it's an impossible ideal to achieve. The virgin that has children, it
Yeah.
is kind of an impossible thing to achieve. Um, but in this respect, because she was the model mother, this, was very appealing to all kinds of different religious Catholic groups across Europe. And in this respect, she always occupies important like positions in cathedrals and things like that. What we do know, though, is that the conversos, for some reason or another, as well as Muslim converts to Christianity, seem to have an affinity for Mary. So, for instance, and this is I think one of the best examples. So there is Our Lady of Guadalupe, not the
Mhm.
one in Mexico, but the one in Spain. And so Guadalupe, Spain, is a royal monastery. And that particular depiction of Mary has a darker toned skin. And it was believed that Moriscos had turned to, so Muslim converts to Christianity had found kind of like they saw themselves in her, that a more olive complected community. And so they said, I see myself in Mary and I can worship as a Christian through her. Well, the corollary is actually in Mexico for even someone like me, which is we have Our Lady of Guadalupe and Mexico City, and she's a darker skinned person. And she appeals to this mixture of indigenous and Spanish communities. And we see ourselves in her. So I think in this respect, when we think about Mary, there was something about this kind of divine feminine that could be seen in Mary that was universally appealing. And also, it's not a focus now exclusively on the creation of Christ as this miracle or the Messiah. It's this kind of alternate path to the holy, alternate path to God. And I think that in some ways, this allows for kind of to have it both ways. In some ways, I'm not going to focus on Christ. I'm going to focus on Mary as this devoted mother and a good person. And I think it's convenient that, that there's the matrilineal kind of component to that. I think it softens it's Catholicism light maybe in some way that it allows for it to move forward. So we don't know who started it, but clearly, what we see in Spain was conversos, specifically this rabbinic family had become Marianist, very devoted to her. And, that I leave it at that. It's an open question.
Yeah, and it's interesting, I think also the feminine part of this, because I'm sure that when Professor Renee Melamed comes in a few weeks, she's going to be talking about women in the Conversos, particularly in Castile, and some of that is the Esther as a persona, and the female here as the strength of the family, the spiritual strength of the family, I think plays into it. I mean,
Absolutely. And, if I'd had more time, what I would have really talked about was, the Carvajal and Santa Maria women in the family who created these entire religious devotions to Mary and set up monasteries and convents to kind of commemorate the family, but also they were very, very active in shaping religion. So they, down to the point of they would select the actual fabric they were buying to make the clothing for the nuns' habits. They selected how a building was to be built to house the nuns. They specified what prayers would be said and how those would be said, and lastly specified where their body would be interred in there to commemorate. So it's another piece of it. Also, I think, in a really, really important way, facilitate a way for women to more actively participate and guide religion inside of Spain in a way that in the past they'd be completely excluded because they're not men. So again, I think this is related to the Conversos, which is like, yeah, there are a lot of strong women around us. They want to do stuff. Let's get them
Wow.
involved.
I want to make sure to continue this. Jot it down as a note for next week if you don't mind, that we're going to go, because I know people have to go, but I would love this to be a topic to at least touch upon next week with our Q&As. And I do look forward to seeing
Well,
everybody next week. I'm going to say have a wonderful rest of your day, and thank you, Professor Martinez-Dávila, and thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you all next week.
thanks again, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.